Dagsy is going to talk to us tonight about face perception. This boy's got a PhD, so I believe many of you do. Sorry, he does not have yet his PhD. There's a tense issue there. I'm sure it's an inevitability myself. His research is on how people form their first impressions of trustworthiness. I can see he's already categorised me. He's always been interested in human behaviour, although you have. Anyway, give it up for Dagsy. There he is.
I don't know what the title is up there, but yeah, first of all, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming here tonight to support me, the other speakers, and just science in general. But tonight I'll be talking, well, first of all, my name is Derek. I'm a PhD student from the University of Western Australia, and I'll be giving a talk about all about faces and how important faces can be in our lives. So before we start, just like to ask everyone to think about how many faces you see every single day. Probably a lot more than you can count. You see them at home, when you go out, on TV, movies, faces are everywhere. Even right now, if you look around you, there's faces all around you. And faces are so important to us that faces are... I don't know what's wrong with the slides, but it's not meant to be on there right now. Well, we'll see how it goes. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is faces are everywhere, even when they're not there, and then this picture's going to come up. So, I'm sure you've all gone around life seeing inanimate objects that look eerily like faces staring back at you. And sometimes these faces can even look like specific characters or people. There's even a Twitter dedicated to posting pictures of things that look like faces. And faces are important to us. And this is a common occurrence because our brains are attuned to look for faces and face-like configurations. But why are faces so important? What are the kinds of different information that we can extract from a face? Does anyone want to give me any examples of some information that we can get from looking at a face? Yeah?
Perhaps what they're feeling.
Sorry?
Perhaps what they're feeling in that one. How they're feeling.
Yeah, you can tell how they're feeling. Anyone else? Yes?
How old someone is.
Yeah, you can tell someone's age.
If you know them or not.
Yeah, and if you recognise them or not. And yeah, so that's probably one of the first things you realise when you see someone is their identity, who they are, whether you know them or not. And as I said before, you can tell things like how someone's feeling. So I don't know why it's not coming up, but anyway, you can recognise other things like how someone's feeling, what social groups they belong to, like their ethnicity or gender, and we make all sorts of other impressions of people, like how attractive people are. But we'll get onto that a bit later. Yeah, so you may think you're pretty good at recognising faces. You can tell who your family members are, who your friends are, and you don't usually, mistake them for other people. But people aren't perfect, and sometimes they do make mistakes. And these mistakes can have very serious consequences. So I'll tell you a story about a real-life criminal case that happened in 1987. So there was this man, Ronald Cotton, who was arrested after being charged with sexual assault based on one of the evidence from one of the victims, Jennifer Thompson. And she said, I was positive. I couldn't have been more certain of anything in my life. So she was quite confident that they got the right man, Ronald Cotton. But in 1995, when DNA evidence started to be used more prevalently, they went back to old cases to re-examine them, and shockingly they found that Ronald Cotton was actually innocent, and it was this man, Bobby Poole, who was the actual criminal. And what's interesting is that even after all this happened, when Jennifer Thompson thinks back to when it happened, when she gets flashbacks, she still sees Ronald Cotton's face in her memory, even though she knows that it wasn't him. But how could this have happened? Okay? How could she have made such a big mistake in such a serious situation? Well, to know this, we need to understand that face perception can be biased. So there's this thing called the own race or other race effect, where people are much better at recognizing faces that are the same race as themselves compared to other races. So people from other races may look more similar than people. And I'm sure you've all heard at some point someone say that all Asians look the same. Well, it happens to everyone with every race. And this is exactly what happened with the previous case. So Jennifer Thompson was Caucasian, whereas the attacker was African American. So to her, she would have had a harder time telling them apart. But it's not just race. We can still be biased towards other things. We have another thing is the own age effect, where you're much better at recognizing faces if they're the same age as you, or at least close to the same age. But since people aren't perfect, there's been a bit of a rise in popularity recently in like face recognition AI and face recognition technology. So I don't know what's wrong with these slides, but anyway, is AI perfect then? Well, let's have a look. In China, last year, it's a country that's well known for using a lot of face recognition technology. This Chinese businesswoman was accused of jaywalking after being spotted by one of these AI cameras. But when they looked at the footage, it turns out that it was actually just a face was on the side of a bus that went past the zebra crossing. And again, in America, Amazon also made a face recognition AI, which they named Recognition, but with a K, because they're cool. They were trying to see how well it would do. So they gave it a bunch of faces of criminals and a bunch of non-criminal faces as well, and had to try and sort out which was which. And as you can see there, it misidentified 28 members of Congress as being criminals. So what we can learn from this is that either AI is not perfect, or that all American politicians are criminals. Anyway, more seriously, what's interesting is that people of colour were actually overrepresented in this misidentification. So about 20% of Congress was made out of people of colour, but almost 40% of the misidentifications, so almost double, happened with people of colour. So as you can see, AI may not be perfect because the people who make it aren't perfect, and the same biases that the people have may trickle down into the AI as well. And you don't have to look very far to find this face recognition technology. Our very own Perth is actually apparently getting these AI cameras put up around the city, and apparently they'll be able to recognize your face and track your movements throughout the city as well. So we'll see how that goes. Now we'll move on to something a bit different. I'm going to ask everyone a question. So I'm going to show you two faces, and I want you guys to tell me which face looks more trustworthy than the other. If it's face one, put your hands up. If it's face two, keep your hands down. But wait till I show you both faces. So here's face one, and here's face two. So which one do you think is more trustworthy? Hands up for face one. Okay, cool, so a lot of people agree. Now let's try that again. Face one, and here's face two. Same thing again, which one do you think is more trustworthy? Hands up for face one. Right, so again, a lot of consensus. So yeah, as you can see, we judge someone's character based on their face. And this is what we call first impressions, and what my research is more focused on. And these impressions can actually happen within the first few milliseconds of seeing someone's face. And we do talk about first impressions, in our daily lives as well. Probably one of the most common things that you've heard is, don't judge a book by its cover. But do we actually listen to that advice? Well, it turns out, not really. We usually judge people by their face, and these first impressions can actually affect people's behaviour and have different consequences. So let's have a look at a few of these different things. So we'll look at trustworthiness first. You saw that people judge how trustworthy someone looks. And research has shown that more trustworthy looking people were less likely to be charged in court than untrustworthy looking people, regardless of whether they were actually innocent or not. And similarly, more trustworthy looking CEOs ended up being the ones who made the most profits from their business. Now, another impression that we make from faces is competence. And studies have shown that people who had more competent looking faces ended up getting hired, were more likely to get hired compared to people who had less competent faces, regardless of any other factors like their qualifications or skills. But perhaps more alarming is that these impressions of competence actually predicted election results. So there's this one study where people were shown a bunch of faces of politicians, but they didn't know who they were. They'd never seen the faces before. And they had to judge the faces on how competent they looked. And what they found was that more competent looking politicians ended up being the ones that got elected. And even children were able to accurately tell which politician got elected just by judging their face. Now let's move on to like a pretty obvious impression we make of others. Man, I don't know what's going on in these slides. There. Anyway, it's ruined the joke now. But anyway, more attractive people are more popular on dating sites. Probably easy to tell. But more importantly, however, more attractive people were more likely to be hired for jobs and also more likely to receive help when they needed it. But there was this one study, which is interesting, where people were applying for a hypothetical job or internship, and they were shown a picture of a rival that was also applying for the same job. And what they found, and they had to give their impressions of the rival. And what they found was that if the rivals were more attractive, then the participants felt more jealous towards the rival, and they were less confident in their own ability to get the job. So what that means is that they felt that the more attractive rivals were more likely to get the job over themselves. Hence the picture, which I can't time it now, so much for comedic timing. But so as you can see, we make a lot of different impressions of people, whether we mean to or not, and these impressions can affect how we act towards other people. So we've talked about what impressions we make, the kinds of consequences these impressions can have, but what my research is more focused on is how we make these impressions. Everything's out of order again, but so anyway, what my research is focused on is whether we can make impressions of trustworthiness spontaneously. So what that means is whether we make these impressions without being asked to do so, like whether they happen automatically or not. And to do that, I use EEG, or electroencephalography, which is just a fancy way of saying I measure the electrical signals in your brain. And you can see some of my friends hooked up to the EEG systems there. So what that involves is putting on like a red cap, like a swim cap, and then you attach a bunch of electrodes on your head, which then transfer the electrical signals to the computer, which you can read. Can't really see it, but you can read it on the computer screen and you can record it. But what does that have to do with impressions? Well, let's say I show you a bunch of trustworthy looking faces. And every now and again, there's a few untrustworthy looking faces thrown in the mix as well. If your brain goes, hey, wait a minute, that face is different, then you should get a bit of spike in your electrical signal of your brain, and we can record that using the EEG. And what that tells us, if that happens, is that your brain was able to tell the difference between trustworthy and untrustworthy faces without us telling you to make any kind of judgment at all. So before I finish, I'd just like to say thank you to all my colleagues, my supervisors, funders, and to all of you lovely people for coming here tonight. I hope that everyone was able to face the facts tonight and see and realize just how much faces can shape our lives. Thank you.
Okay, Gary, you don't get over that easily. So, questions? I'm sprigging it. Who's got one? Come on! You can't. Right there. I'm coming. Nobody likes a quiet question, do they?
Thanks for the talk, it's really interesting, and your research project sounds amazing. I'm just really interested to know, do you have, you talk a lot about more trustworthy persons and that sort of thing. Do you have any theories or hypotheses about what it is in the face that our brains detect and say that person looks untrustworthy or competent?
Yeah, well, there's a few things in terms of trustworthiness.
What makes somebody look dodgy?
Well, there's a few factors we've found that make people look more trustworthy or less trustworthy. For example, if someone's more masculine looking, they're less trustworthy. Or it's like expressions as well. So if someone's smiling, they look more trustworthy, whereas someone's angry, they look less trustworthy. So things like that, there's a lot of different factors that go into that as well.
More questions? Mate, you sit at the front, son.
Just wondering if there's any difference that you found in your research between what you see going on in people's brains in terms of trustworthiness and their perception of it and what they report. So I know you see people are trustworthy, you're even consciously thinking that, but subconsciously don't feel the same way. Is there discrepancies? And have you looked at that?
Discrepancies, mate, in the data. Bunch of scientists here, they all love a bit of data.
Yeah, so at the end, well, what I talked about before, we showed the faces on the screen. They're actually shown pretty rapidly, so 6 times a second. So they don't really have time to think too much about the faces, so they look at them. But what we do afterwards is we do ask them to rate each face on how trustworthy they look. And we do find that, like the trustworthy faces that we make look trustworthy, they do find trustworthy.
Okay.
And the EEG says the same thing as well.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
One more question, come on. Right at the back. Eating nachos.
Can you talk a bit about what the end game of the research is and how you can insulate against unethical uses of it?
Yeah, endgame, Dexy, come on. Where's it all going, mate? We've come to a conclusion here.
So I'm a bit confused about the question. So the first part was what we want to do with the research. I'm just halfway through my PhD, so I haven't thought too much about the whole picture. But I'm just working on this because recently there's been a bit of a debate on whether these impressions actually happen automatically or not, whether they need to be cued or they don't need to be cued. And I guess, for example, if they don't need to be cued, then in some instances it might be better not to see the face of the person before any judgments are made in some sort of situation, maybe interviews or court or things like that. I'm not sure about the ethics question though.
Well, I guess image classification, it fits in a long history of, like you say, different race profiling and so on. So some of these things which might say there's a general consensus against trustworthiness for a particular group of people, that could have consequences if sort of validating in scientific work.
I guess it depends on whether these impressions are actually accurate or not. I think a lot of people do make impressions, and there's some consensus, but there's also a lot of individual variability in the impressions people make as well, which I'll be researching next year.
Cheers, mate. Give it up. Thank you. Put on mental space.